Okay, we are live. Happy Monday afternoon, just in the afternoon hour to everybody. And we have a fun and unfortunately challenging policy issue to talk about today, but very interesting stuff going on in New York. And we're joined here on From the Swamp to the States by James Hanley, who's with the Empire Center in Albany. Welcome to the podcast, James.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So as usual, Empire Center is keeping an eye on the crazy stuff that happens in New York State and the constant aggrievement of taxpayers that seems to be the trend there. So really appreciate James joining us today to talk about what's going on Long Island with the state considering municipalizing the power electric provider, which is I think that's the most straightforward way to explain what's going on.
Yes.
But I mean, this is an important issue because it's something, we've seen other states try. So we're talking about Long Island specifically at the moment, but we've seen this happen, decades ago. This is an idea that is a terrible one. And, as usual, when government starts running things and trying to operate like a business or run an enterprise, there are a lot of side effects that are negative. And so this is something that everyone should pay attention to. Is this issue just, this pie in the sky idea the government's going to do a better job of providing your electricity will not go away. So James is going to help explain why that's not the greatest idea. So just before we get started with James, I wanted to remind everybody, if you have comments, you have questions, you might have some longer questions on this issue, please throw them into Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, at Tax Reformer, and let us know, and we'll be happy to answer them as we go here for the next 20 minutes or so. So James, kick us off with, what the heck is LIPA, the Long Island Power Authority? What's PSEG? Who are these players, and what's the history here that's brought us to this moment?
All right. Well, the history is Long Island is unique as far as power generation goes. Its history begins with the Long Island Lighting Company, or LILCO. And LILCO was never very popular. It was criticized for having high energy prices. But the big blow up came in the mid 80s when they built the Shoreham nuclear plant. Had a lot of support and pressure from the federal government to build it because in the 70s we thought we were moving towards nuclear power, which I think we should have, but Long Island may not have been the best place to build it. People were worried about how they would be able to escape the island in case of emergency. I come from the Midwest. There are many roads getting out from anywhere in the Midwest. On Long Island, there are a few roads getting off the island, right? And a lot of people out there. So emergency escape was a legitimate question. And ultimately, Shoreham was shut down after completion and just a little bit of testing, but without ever producing power for customers, leaving a large debt, billions of dollars. And then Hurricane Gloria hit, and LILCO did a very poor job in response to Hurricane Gloria, and that was the end of it. The legislature stepped in, created the Long Island Power Authority, which took on all of LILCO's stock and basically bought up the Shoreham nuclear plant and all of its transmission lines. And then instead of becoming a fully municipalized power authority, it contracted out the management of the system to a company called Keyspan, which is basically a subsidiary of National Grid. There is no other utility in the country that is municipally owned and privately operated, and that makes Long Island unique in that respect too. There are a lot of other areas, a lot of other issue areas where we have public-private contracts like that. In the national parks, it's private contractors that run the lodgings that are owned by the National Park Service and so on. A lot of school districts contract out for bus services for their students. Not all do, but some do. So these private-public contracts can work well. They're just, it's unique in the power sector here for Long Island.
Right.
And that makes it a little bit hard to defend, right? Something that hasn't worked particularly well and is unique is hard to defend. After tropical superstorm Sandy, where Keyspan did a very bad job responding to that, the contract was taken over by PSEG, Public Service Enterprise Group, and then they run it, and then they did a poor job in response to Storm Isaias, and that's what led to the current demands for municipalization there. So the one constant in all of this has not been the type of utility that's been in place, but the fact that Long Island is really, really susceptible to storms because it sticks
And you
out in the
mentioned
light.
the storms.
Yes.
So let's focus in just at least briefly on the storm thing. I mean, we're saying there's been problems responding to hurricanes and tropical storms and all this stuff. What should have been done better? Could have been done better? What are some of the specific failures in response to storms?
Well, the specific problem that Long Island faces in as far as storm goes is its location. There are very few places in the country that are situated quite like it, where it sticks out at right angles to the rest of the country. And so storms that come churning their way up the coast slam directly into it. The southern side of the island, the offshore subsurface is very rocky, and so there's no soft underwater soil to absorb some of the storm surge, and so it exacerbates the storm surges as the island rises up from the south to the north. And of course, it's directly in the way of high winds. So what really needs to be done in Long Island is to harden the system, to have much stronger power poles, to put a lot of the lines underground, to better protect substations from flooding, and all of that takes a lot of money. And whether you municipalize it or privatize it or leave it the same as it is right now, that's going to take a lot of money. And already LIPA has still a tremendous amount of debt. They began with $8 billion in debt from the Shoreham debacle, and currently they have close to $10 billion in debt. So they may have paid off Shoreham almost, but they've taken on even more debt. So it's about $8,000 per ratepayer. So where's the extra money going to come from to harden the system?
But just to put a finer point on the storm part of this, I mean, what if we're upset and the folks on Long Island are upset about post-storm response, how is municipalization then the answer to some of these concerns?
It's not.
Okay. I mean, it sounds like there's nothing different.
No, it's a geographical problem and a money problem. It is possible to prepare the whole system for these storm surges, but as I said, it's tremendously expensive. It will probably happen over time as they replace systems, but it's going to take generations probably. And there's nothing a municipalized system can do to change the geography of Long Island, its susceptibility to storms, or to be able to respond any more quickly once everything goes down. These when you get these big storms, they have to bring in workers from outside the region. They don't have enough workers of their own on standby to respond in emergencies, and they can't bring them in from within the region because all the nearby energy providers are also worried that the storm might hit their area too, so they're keeping their own people on standby for themselves. So they have to look as far as Pennsylvania and Ohio to bring in workers ahead of time in case a storm hits. Well, so is the municipalization authority, right? They're not going to have a larger number of people who normally don't have any work to do because they're sitting on standby for that storm that comes once every few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it would strike me that if the government then runs everything, they might even be less responsive to public outrage. We might have less accountability rather than more.
Yeah, there's some people treat the word public as sort of a magic incantation. It's public, so they're responsive to the public, so therefore they will do better for the public. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes being public, not having a profit motive, means you can slack off a lot more. And they still have, the people who are involved still have their own agendas, their own interests, and sometimes things can simply get corrupt in a public system. A lot depends, who appoints these people, where they come from. Right now, the trustees are appointed from Albany. There's no guarantee that they're going to be people who really have Long Islanders' interests at heart, or who will. I mean, the thing with PSEG, PSEG took a $30 million hit from the Storm Isaias. They had to return $30 million to the ratepayers of Long Island, and that's out of about $80 million a year that they get in management fees. So that's a huge proportion. And the contract was rewritten so that only about $40 million now is guaranteed management fees, and the other up to $40 million is all dependent on performance, right? So they have a real incentive to be responsive now, more than they did before. If public authorities don't necessarily have if they don't pay a price for bad performance, then they don't have much incentive to ensure good performance.
And that separation between the contractor and the government entity at least gives government somebody to focus on to hold them accountable, yes. And it doesn't become an excuse-making exercise where then it's all their fault, it's all the government's fault if something's going wrong. So then they start obfuscating and not taking responsibility. Now they can, which is possibly contributing to some of this sense, whatever sense there is in the public, that PSEG is a problem because the government's pointing to them when something's going wrong. Oh, there's a storm that was unavoidable. There's a problem. Don't blame us, blame those guys.
Yeah, exactly. And so if they municipalize LIPA and this happens again, which it will happen again, I mean, that's inescapable, right? We don't know when, but we know another big storm will hit. We know that the systems will not have been fully hardened yet. There won't be any greater management expertise for municipalized LIPA than there is for PSEG, and possibly less. Well, are people going to blame municipalization then? No, they'll blame the individuals involved, but they won't ever sense that maybe municipalization wasn't the real answer.
Absolutely. Well, and I'll remind folks, if you have a question, throw it in the chat. We're talking to James Hanley with the Empire Center in Albany, New York, about a bizarre scheme to municipalize the power grid on Long Island. But let's talk about cost, James. I mean, the reason this is an issue beyond Long Island is that there are campaigns to municipalize these things every once in a while in different parts of the country. And I'd say the main pitch, or at least what seems like the main pitch to me, is, well, this is going to save everybody money. We're going to save consumers money on their energy. The government's here to help. I think it's Ronald Reagan who said those are the scariest words in the English language. And okay, so sometimes the government is able to come in, if they municipalize, they can obscure costs, but they can't make the cost disappear. So there's a bit of a sleight of hand there where maybe they can make it so some consumer's bill is more at a fixed rate, but those costs are going somewhere. So in this scenario with Long Island, what's going on with costs? What is the claim on savings, and what's really going on behind that claim?
All right. The big claim on savings is that by not paying PSEG roughly $80 million a year in management fees, that money will be saved. Okay. Now, the problem with that is it's worthwhile paying for expertise, right? People see profit as something that can be avoided and a wasted cost, but profit is the incentive to drive down costs and to keep costs under control. If costs rise too much, it's harder to make profit. That's plain simple economics. But also history of LIPA and PSEG is that when PSEG came on, LIPA was looking at building a new power plant and reopening some shuttered power plants because they were predicting there was going to be very dramatically increasing demand for power on Long Island. And PSEG analyzed it and said, no, it's going to be, power demand is going to be flat until sometime in the 2030s. We don't need these, they'll be very costly. And so they saved LIPA ratepayers over $2 billion, which is about a quarter century worth of the management fees that they're receiving. So I mean that's a big savings, right? Now, if LIPA runs efficiently enough as a municipalized power authority, and some do, I'll be honest about that, some do. But if it's still a big if it runs efficiently enough as a power authority, it can save that money. But I was listening in to the commission hearing. They finally had their first commission hearing about 2 months late. So, I mean, they haven't even been able to organize this process. They're supposed to have a draft plan due by the end of this month. They've had 6 months to do it, and they're going to cram it into a few weeks. So, it's going to be a slapdash effort.
Yeah.
Or more likely, somebody wrote it ahead of time, and it's going to be all, preordained.
Yeah, it's going to be a cover for the conclusion that was already reached.
Exactly. But if you listen to the commission hearing, all the people who are testifying, all these public power advocates, they already have plans for spending all that $80 million and more on a variety of other social projects to go along with this. So savings? No, not really. Ability to pay down that debt faster through those savings? No, because they plan to, if these advocates have their way, they're going to be spending on a wild variety of projects. No discipline at all.
Yeah, so well, we should make sure, as you said, that PSEG gets the credit it deserves for saving some money with their guidance. And now we're going to see added costs. Now, you mentioned program spending, social spending along with this. What's that about?
Well, social activists always have projects that they want government to spend money on. And they never stop to think about whether there's a limit to how much money is really available. And so they want more spending for poorer communities. I'll be fair with that. They want to ensure that nobody has to pay too much for their electricity, not realizing that could give people incentives to waste electricity. They want to also spend money on more green energy, which unfortunately is, it's clean, but the big danger is there, it's not reliable. And Long Island Power has been expensive, but it's been reliable except during these storm events. We go too much towards renewable energy, wind energy particularly is what they're looking at. They lose reliability, and that's a big risk. But of course, nobody who advocates it will either blame municipalization or renewable energy if the lights go out because the wind turbines stop turning during a wind lull. So various projects like that, various environmental restoration projects, and so on.
So there's some other stuff thrown in with this plan.
People see it as an opportunity to throw in all their pet projects.
Yeah. So it's creating a train that people want to get more spending on.
Right.
Part of a state budget that was $222 billion last year. It's completely unsustainable. We'll be in the red again shortly, and I think that's another area where federal taxpayers, unfortunately, will need to pay attention because you have unsustainable budgets like we have in New York, Illinois, California. Probably going to be looking for some help from taxpayers in other states before they start trimming their belt there. So you're talking about this commission that's going on. Let's get into that because that's another ridiculous part of this process. We had legislation that was passed to study the municipalization. So that was, if I have the sponsors correctly, Assemblyman Fred Teal, Senator Gogren. So they put this bill together, and now we're almost at the end of the year, and the commission consists of a bunch of officials, elected officials, stakeholders who are supposed to come up with a plan. So what's going on there? They haven't had hearings at all. I mean, how is this acceptable?
Well, they finally had their first public hearing last week. They were supposed to have 3 public hearings in Long Island and Queens by the end of September. But they didn't even appoint, the Democrats didn't even appoint their people until, I believe, August or September. They didn't choose an executive director for the commission until sometime in October or late September. And they finally had their first hearings 2 months late. And so, again, they're supposed to have a draft plan by the end of this month and a final plan by the end of April. They could have been working on this all along, right? They could have been putting their staff together throughout the summer. Didn't do any of that, not until very late. So none of it smacks of a very serious effort, thoughtful effort to study anything. And if you look at the language of the legislation, it doesn't exactly say study. It says to propose the best way to municipalize it, essentially. So clearly the whole thing is designed to come up with a municipalization plan, which, if you look across the country, municipalized power authorities mostly don't do a bad job. There are a lot more of them than there are investor-owned utilities, although investor-owned utilities serve about 70% of the public across the country. But in New York, the municipalized authorities actually charge just slightly higher prices on average than the investor-owned utilities. Less than a penny's difference, but a little bit more. So, it's not clear that municipalization is the way to go in terms of ratepayer savings either. But clearly this is not something, what worries me is it's not something they're going to think out carefully. They're going to slap together some untested model at the last minute, pretend they've done a real deep dive into it, and run it through the next legislative session at the last minute, because the final draft is supposed to be due in the end of April. Usually they finish their work by sometime around the end of May, right? So you know that the rest of the legislature is not going to give it a real close look. But with the Democrats' control of each chamber, there's a very good chance they're just going to lash onto that magic word public or municipal, and think that automatically achieves great things.
Absolutely. Well, and dealing with a process that seems more like a sham and cover for an idea that people decided they're pushing one way or the other. When we're calling, I don't know exactly when it was, but when the commission was sort of, maybe when the bill was going through earlier this year to establish the commission, a number of businesses and on Long Island said, well, why don't you consider a privatization option if we're studying this situation? And of course that was rejected. So I think that, through that and through the extreme delays in getting the commission together and actually holding public hearings, I think it's pretty clear that public accountability is not part of this process. It's not a serious study of the situation to weigh pros and cons, because otherwise municipalization would not be the answer. And so this is just more cover for the municipalization government takeover idea. James, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your insight. There's a lot of background here, and we're breaking it down in a short period of time, but definitely check out James's writing on this. Is a piece in Newsday, the major Long Island newspaper, and EmpireCenter.org on this, which we're sharing in the chat, so you can get more background on this situation. And certainly check out what we were at reverdinatATR.org and get more information on why some of the other municipalization pushes around the country cost taxpayers more money in the end and create problems. So check all that out for more background. And yeah, James, where else can folks find you guys?
EmpireCenter.org. We look at we're a good government watchdog is what we really are. And trying to keep a close eye on what's happening in New York State politics and keep it transparent, clean, and hopefully sensible.
Well, there's a lot to watch in New York State, so they keep
Yes,
you busy.
Indeed. Yes. Always something to be paying attention to.
Thanks again, everybody, for joining, and we'll have the audio podcast up and out on Apple Podcasts and wherever else you get your podcasts. So thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Thanks for having me.